Hey everyone, I'm Rick Hennigan. I'm the primary developer of Notebook Assistant, and today I will be talking about Notebook Assistant. Big surprise. Last year I spoke about an early prototype of this. It wasn't actually called Notebook Assistant at the time, but it was released after last year's tech conference. So I'm going to start out with a bit of a recap for people that might not be familiar with what Notebook Assistant is, the basic features. For people that are familiar with it, after that, I'll be talking about, newer features that have been released that maybe people don't know about, then things that are coming soon, like, any day now, that type of thing, and then things that are in development for further out. So let me get this. So in the default toolbar, you have this Notebook Assistant button here that opens the window for you. And then from there, you just start typing and asking what you want. I'm going to be automating a lot of this in the interest of time, but all I'm doing is basically pre-filling these things in, setting window size, stuff like that. So you can ask questions in natural conversational language, and Notebook Assistant is an LLM, or rather a collection of LLMs that understands Wolfram technology. And you can just ask it the sorts of things that you would ask of an expert of Wolfram documentation and resources. So its knowledge is kept up to date every time we have a new release. We also rebuild a lot of the information that it has. So it's always current for the currently released version. Like for here, I asked a question that, for example, ChatGPT wouldn't know how to do this with Wolfram language because that model was trained before 14.3 came out. And you can see this is a new symbol in 14.3. Notebook Assistant just knows about this because it's kept up to date with every release. Another thing it knows about are various Wolfram resources outside of documentation. So the function repository, things like that. So, it knew to get this type of thing. This is another thing where a regular chatbot probably wouldn't be able to solve. I actually have an example here for comparison. So same thing here. It gave me a whole bunch of code here. It didn't know that there was a very simple solution to this in the function repository. And to be fair, it was on the right track, but ultimately it didn't actually work. And this will take a lot of effort, reading the code and trying to fix these issues. It gets you a lot of the way there, but you'd still have to, fix these things. But because Notebook Assistant knows about a lot of this stuff that's already done, it just gave me a very simple answer, and it's very easy for me to verify that it gave me what I wanted. So let me close that. So tool calling. Not only can Notebook Assistant just give you text answers based on its knowledge, it can actually run computations for you to actually give you answers. So that could be something like this. It could be running code to verify that it's actually giving you the correct answer. Things like that. It can also, even though it's a text LLM, when it computes things that produce things like graphics, it can actually include those in its response, which is pretty handy. So it wrote text, but magically you have an image here in the output. So tool calling is one of the major features here. The other thing, and this is something that really sets it apart from regular chat notebooks, which you might be familiar with. I'm not going to go into detail about them here. Is the idea of notebook context. So I have my notebook here. I can select something, and this is effectively like pointing to something. You know, if I had a human standing next to me, someone helping me, I could point to my screen at something and ask a question about it, like, you know, what's this? And Notebook Assistant understands what I'm talking about because I've selected something. It not only sees the current notebook that I have open, and you could see which notebook it's considering down at this focus section here, but it understands where my selection is. And it doesn't just see the selection, it sees the stuff around it, so it understands the context. So then I can say something like, so it knows I'm talking about this image, but it understands that I want to modify this input code to achieve what I want here. So it gave me new code, and I can run that and evaluate it. Another thing it can do is compute with things from your notebook. So I have a notebook here with an image in it. And I could say something like color negate that image. You know, you can see I have it selected here. When I hit send, it can basically grab that as if you were to copy and paste that into an input. So you can see the code that it evaluated here. Again, it's a text-based LLM, but it was able to utilize this nice notebook box representation of something right in its code. It can't do that for everything that you can have in notebooks, but it can do it for a few different things. Like I'll show another example here. So like audio, it can also do video, things like that. A lot of dynamic stuff. So that, I believe, yeah, audio plot. I'm not going to show video just because it's large and will be slower, but it's the same idea, and that still works. So let me go back here. Yeah, and as I mentioned before, this focus indicator tells you what it's actually looking at. Like I programmatically set this so it would lock to this notebook that I'm generating, but normally it would just follow whichever one you had selected last. And if you want to disable that, and you should disable it if your question has nothing to do with the stuff you're currently working on, you just uncheck that, and then it can't see any notebooks. So just an example of what that does. So if I uncheck that, and now I do that same thing I did before, oh, hang on a second. So the focus is unchecked. It doesn't see any notebooks. So all it sees is the fact that I said, what's this? So it assumes I'm talking about the Notebook Assistant chat interface. So perfectly reasonable interpretation of that question in this case. So some of the newer features that have been rolled out, a lot of it has been under the hood and you wouldn't necessarily see it. There's things to improve its knowledge that's been ongoing. We've added new sources of knowledge. When we originally released, it didn't know about anything in the data repository. Now it does. Oh, it's evaluating something I didn't expect. Another thing to be aware of, it's not deterministic. You'll get something different every time. And the 5 or so times that I tested this, it did the thing I was expecting, and now, of course, it does something different. So we'll see what it's actually doing here. I got a progress indicator in my other. Oh, I didn't even know that was a thing. Okay, but I guess that's an interpretation of it, but I really wanted to see the data repository entry. No, I'm going to cancel that. It's now doing something different for some reason. But it also knows about the neural net repository. And this has been something that I've found really useful as well. So I ask Notebook Assistant questions about all kinds of things. I've been using the language for about 15 years. I don't know it all. Out of all the system functions we have, I'm still just discovering new ones all the time. And now even more so, I'm discovering new things in like the data repository and Packlet repository and things like that. And Packlet repository, not all Packlets show up on here because that is kind of a free-for-all thing. Anyone can publish whatever we want in there. So we basically are just pulling down like a pre-approved set of what can appear in here, because we don't want somebody to just publish something that is low quality and have that polluting the knowledge of Notebook Assistant. But there are quite a few Packlets it now is aware of. And this, by the way, this question, MCP server and all that stuff, on Friday, I'll be going into a lot of detail about that stuff. So you should definitely check that out if you're interested in how to give these kinds of capabilities to other LLM-based applications. Okay, so interface updates that we've had since then. A lot of these are like quality of life fixes, but they're important and nice. We have this history menu. The conversations I'm generating now programmatically aren't showing up in here. That's deliberate, just because I don't want to pollute them. But we've added this paging here, which became very necessary when you have like hundreds of these, like I do. It was getting very, very slow. So it's just a quality of life fix. There's also dark mode support that's been added recently. So there's been a lot of effort in here to get all the different things that Notebook Assistant can produce and all the different visuals and all that stuff to look nice in dark mode. And that's all in place now, which is nice. A nice feature that we've added that people might not know about. So previously, when we released this input field was only strings. Actually, let me turn off dark mode because I have things set up for late mode. But we made it so now you can paste in any arbitrary boxes into this input field. And because this is a multimodal model that understands images, it can use that visual understanding to try and figure out what you want. It's still very much just going to be the LLM's visual capabilities when you're asking something like this. So don't expect it to be able to determine some, don't use it as like a sort of plot OCR. Maybe this wasn't the best example. It's not doing any magic computation here to figure out that's a sine wave. It's just, that's just the LLM guessing. But that you can use it as like an approximation kind of thing. But in addition to, like I was saying, you can do any arbitrary boxes you want in here. So let's say you've copied something out of a notebook that is in traditional form and you want to run that as code, but you don't know how. You can just now paste it in and ask. So just minor convenience stuff. All right. And yeah, like I said, there's been a lot of improvements under the hood. A lot of it is just building up the knowledge of what the LLM is able to see when it's answering these questions and retrieving that knowledge at the right time. So a lot of that is just converting all the content we have, like from documentation, resources, things like that, into plain text representations that the LLM can understand. But we've made a lot of improvements there, and a lot more information is now available. So we've added like these other repositories, but we've also expanded the amount of documentation that it knows about. So previously it didn't understand things like workflow pages, tutorials, things like that, but now it has everything. So every documentation page has been, processed into a knowledge base in multiple pieces. So that's where we currently are with the released version. There's coming soon, and this is stuff that some of it will be like any day now. There's a Packlet in testing with these updates. There's a new tool for creating notebooks for you, which, there's a couple of specific uses for this that people have been asking for. I don't know how useful this will be to most people. Maybe you can think of things that you would want this to do, but it shouldn't, if you don't ever use it, it shouldn't affect anything. It's not going to try to create notebooks for you all the time unless you're asking for a notebook. So yeah, it can do that now. There are improvements in a lot of the tool outputs with how they're converted to text, so the LLM better understands them. Previously, in the currently released version, the LLM can get very confused with outputs that have multiple images, for example. That is now greatly improved, and it can reference them individually. So before, it would see this as like one sort of expression handle. It didn't understand how to make sense of it. Now it totally understands the output. Similarly, anything that produced a large output, so think of anything that you would evaluate in your notebook, and you would get that, like gray box that shortens it, right? So it's not, 10 billion characters or whatever. The LLM also gets something like that, but it wasn't very good for the LLM. It didn't understand it, and it couldn't read it very well. That is now improved. So if you were running into issues where the LLM just didn't know how to make sense of large outputs, that will be fixed in very, very soon, and any day now. Yeah, so it sees that some of these values, it doesn't see the whole thing. We're not gonna, throw all those tokens at it. That wouldn't be useful, but it sees enough to understand the general idea of what that output looks like. Another feature, and this kind of is dependent on, and I should mention this as well, part of the interface, we have these thumbs up and thumbs down buttons. You should use those because that informs us of directions we need to go, like what types of mistakes is Notebook Assistant making that we should look to fix. So one of the things we found when looking at the feedback data is there are a lot of kind of consistent patterns with syntax errors. So one thing that's difficult for an LLM to do is when you have deeply nested grouping constructs in code. It doesn't happen for something this small. I'm just using this as a simple example. But whenever it writes like a large block of code going over a bunch of lines, you'll frequently find that it uses the wrong type of closer, or it's missing one, or it has an extra one. That becomes very common. And we saw a lot of that in the feedback data. And I don't want to give the wrong impression here. We're not automatically fixing all LLM syntax errors here. There's just certain patterns of them that we found that it made frequently, and now we have automatic fixes for them. So it wrote that thing I asked for, which is not valid syntax. We can see it here, but it thinks it wrote that invalid thing, but we just fixed it automatically, magically. And we find these patterns based on the feedback that users give us. Yeah, and this is something that's actively being worked on. There's a lot of work going into this. We're going to be adding more and more fixes over time as well. And this will only get better. And just so people have the right expectations here, it's not going to fix every syntax error. You'll even find some like this that maybe you thought would be fixed that won't. But we are actively adding more fixes as time goes on. So just keep an eye on that. Programmatic access to Notebook Assistant. This, I'm not sure of the timeline for this one, but this will be coming. It's not exactly the same as what you would get if you evaluate it in here. Like when you use something like LM Synthesize or Chat Evaluate, it doesn't see like your notebooks, for example. It doesn't have the same type of context. What it does have is access to the knowledge of documentation, resources, all that stuff. It does have the tools, but this is something that people have been asking for, and this will be coming out soon. I don't know the exact time. It might be version 15, might be sooner with a backlit update. Yeah, and so these are the things, these are coming very soon. This may be very soon, but that backlit is not something I work on, so I don't know the exact date. So things that are probably further out that are in development, and you know, there are no promises here, but just to give you an idea of the direction we're going. One thing that I think is incredibly useful is seeing how Notebook Assistant found its answers. Like, where did it get the information? So I ask it a question, and I know it looked at documentation. I know it looked at resources, but I don't know which ones it actually used. So this is unformatted. So like I said, this is unreleased and very early development, but the concept is in place. This will be nice and pretty when we eventually release this, but you can see, to answer that question, it looked at this, it looked at that, and it jumps to the exact location in the documentation too. Excuse me. So this is a good way to kind of understand how it came to that conclusion that it gave you. And actually, I should mention, it looked at a lot more than what's in here. This is just what it actually is citing for its response. So it looked at a lot of things that it decided weren't actually relevant to answer the question. So it sees more than it will show here. But this is just saying, this is how I knew this stuff. So this I feel like it's really useful just to follow up on these things as well. Like if you want to read more about, you know, this resource function, you know, in this case, it gave me a link to it here, but if it didn't, I'd have the link and I'd know exactly, you know, how it figured that out. And I could follow up on it on my own if I wanted to. So speech input is something that will be coming. I don't have a timeline for it, but we'll have a way to not just be typing into here, but you'll be able to just speak and have it work. We're actively working on more knowledge sources. So not only like resource system stuff, documentation, but we're actually generating a lot of synthetic data to improve its performance with like the entity framework, for example. So we have entity stuff in documentation, but if you look at any of those pages, you realize that the amount of entities and properties that you could have documentation for is way larger than we could actually document. Like some entity types have thousands of properties. You can't have an example of every one of them in the documentation. So we're synthesizing a lot of these to generate, you know, these vector databases that are basically used for feeding this knowledge to Notebook Assistant. And further out, this will be generating a lot of information on the fly that's verified as well. I'll talk a bit more about how that kind of thing works in the talk Friday, which is about, you know, the computation augmented generation, but those sort of features will be making their way into Notebook Assistant as well. And a research mode, which I don't know if that is the right name, but it's basically something that is like, you know, you might have seen other chat applications have reasoning models that you could turn on, and it will think about things. We want to enable that, but also enable more computation. So spend more effort into pulling relevant documentation, better filtering, things like that. It's basically a toggle for saying, I'm willing to wait for a better answer. And you enable that, run it, and you'll not only get a reasoning model doing reasoning, but you'll also get much better performance from the underlying the parts that make the knowledge stuff work. Yeah, and I have a bunch of tips here. I want to answer some of these questions though. So I'm not going to go over these. Instead, what I'm going to do is in a half an hour, there's a Notebook Assistant workshop. I encourage you to come to that, and I will go into much more detail about how to get the most out of Notebook Assistant. And there's a lot of important stuff here that can really get more performance out of it. So I highly encourage people to come to that. But I do want to answer some of these questions. So someone's asking, when I use Notebook Assistant, are the contents of my chat or Mathematica document used for future training of the LLM? No, we're not using that for training. It's logged for debugging purposes, but it's not going out anywhere. It's not going to be used for training. Feature request, Wolfram language refactoring IDE. Yes, that's something I want to implement. I have ideas of how to do that. The main barrier to something like that is the question of whether or not people want that. So there's a whole bunch of tools we could add to Notebook Assistant. If we just add tons and tons of them, it's going to add too much information for Notebook Assistant, and it could degrade its performance. So we don't want to just add every tool that we have an idea for. But if that kind of thing is something that a lot of people are interested in, I would absolutely love to implement it. Is there any connection to Codex or Claude Code? Come by to the CAG talk on Friday, and I will have a lot of fun answers for that. The answer is yes, but I will go into detail on Friday. Okay, so someone asks, I don't want to pay for this assistant because I already pay for all these separate services. So what workflow do I recommend? So you can use regular chat notebooks. That gets you most of the way there with something like if you have OpenAI or Anthropic, something like that, you've already paid for, you're paying for a service, you have an API key. You can use those, and they have access to a lot of the same knowledge that Notebook Assistant has. It's not going to perform anywhere near as well, though, because we can't make assumptions about these other external services about what models we can use. So it has a basic version of like semantic search to get some of this information. But you can get similar things. It's not going to be as good, but it will work. Accessing the current selection, does that work in 14.3 or is that a 15.0 feature? That's actually been something since release of Notebook Assistant. Surprisingly, a lot of people aren't aware of it though. That's why I wanted to go into more detail about that here. It's been improved since then, like the ability for Notebook Assistant to use like images and audio and stuff from your notebook that I don't think was in the initial release. So someone asked, or someone said, you said it's non-deterministic. Can you set the LLM temperature to 0? Yes, you can. There are settings in the preferences under AI settings, under notebooks, and you can set temperature here. I would not recommend it though. You can set it to 0 and it will give you much more consistent results. It's still not going to be fully deterministic for some technical reasons, but I would not recommend it. Your results will not be better. They'll probably be worse. And the ability to just regenerate an output is really useful. And it's something that I think people should do more often. We actually have a button for it here to regenerate the response. If you don't like what it gave you, but you think it can do better, just hit that button and try again. You can also edit this and then regenerate just by sending this, because this is a chat notebook too. You could just evaluate this cell after editing and it'll regenerate the response. How do I handle agentic background subtasks? So there are very tight guardrails on the LLM subtasks involved in here. They're not fully agentic in the way I think you're probably thinking of. There is this thing that I was talking about, a research mode. This is a much more complex idea where there's a dispatching LLM that's basically assigning tasks to, assigning subtasks to LLMs to perform specialized tasks and things like that. And that's kind of part of how this works. That is still very much in a prototyping phase, so I don't have concrete answers about how all that works yet. But the background subtasks for like a simple, one of the simple background subtasks is coming up with these titles, right? That's something that's done by a separate LLM call. It's not the one writing this answer, but that's something that has very strict guardrails. You're looking for one very specific type of thing, which makes it pretty easy. So there's like a couple things like that involved in here, like generating these sources, for example. The main Notebook Assistant LLM didn't do this. This is another subtask. Do all of these features, or most of them anyway, you've shown apply to the chat cell as well? By chat cell, do you mean like a regular chat input in a notebook? The answer is mostly yes. The things about like a notebook selection do not work, because if you're editing something in here and you're doing, you know, shift return or clicking this button, your selection is always here. So you can't really point at something else. Like you couldn't point to code up here and say, you know, I'm looking at this, but now I want to send this, because your selection moves. So this regular chat inputs in regular notebooks do not have any notebook context aside from the context it sees above the chat input. So someone says, I have a large Packlet, 5,000 lines of Wolfram code. It's too large to load into Notebook Assistant, so I can ask questions in your notebook about the code and such. Is there a workaround for that? Yes. You should come to the CAG talk on Friday. So Notebook Assistant probably isn't going to be the sort of coding agent that you would see from something like Claude Code or Codex, like this sort. That's something that you really, it's sort of like a project-based type of thing that requires a lot of setup to make those work well. Like you have to have like if you want to perform well, you have to have things like the agents file that's explaining your code base and things to do. I don't see Notebook Assistant going that route. I think it's always going to be focused on, you know, the regular notebook environment. But what we can do, and I'll be going into detail on Friday about this, is giving these the functionality that makes Notebook Assistant understand documentation and resources and all that stuff. You can just give that power to Claude Code. And I'm going to show how to do that on Friday. So the last question, is there a way to pay for the Wolfram LLM by credits instead of a subscription fee? I don't want to say something that is incorrect. I think it's been talked about. I don't want to say yes or no to that though, but I could check on that, and maybe I'll have an answer for you at Friday if you wanted to come by for that. So yeah, I think that was all the questions. And I went over time. Okay, so in that case, thank you everyone for coming by. And like I said, the Notebook Assistant workshop is coming up shortly, in a half an hour. And Friday is another one you don't want to miss, especially if you're interested in things like Cloud Code and Codex and Cursor, Visual Studio Code, all that stuff. There'll be a lot more detail on that there. So thank you, everyone, and I'll see y'all later.